We're joined now by Ian Bremmer. He is the Eurasia Group founder and president. He's joining us from New York. Ian, it's good to see you again. So what do you make of these recent surges we have seen and the various states now having to roll this back? Investors are telling us that perhaps this latest wave is not as detrimental to the economy as the first.
Probably not as detrimental, at least not in the near term, because it's much harder to actually close down the economy. I mean, Texas just a few hours ago took some steps towards rollback, but certainly not full lockdown. I think a lot of other governments across the country, despite significant explosions in cases and in hospitalizations, though not yet in deaths, are going to be cautious, but it's very different from saying they're going to go and lock it down. And so that does imply that the economic hit near term is not going to be as grievous, but the human hit is real. And it's very clear that we do not have anything like a unified response. We're not leading with science. There's much more cheerleading coming from the top of the US government than there should be. We're not learning from our own bad experiences in terms of the necessity of social distancing, the necessity of wearing masks, which has become a politicized issue in the United States. And that's not true of any other advanced industrial democracy in the world, but it is true in the United States. And so you saw, okay, only 6,000 people showed up in Tulsa for President Trump's much ballyhooed rally this weekend, but less than 10% of them were wearing masks, including the president, including his advisors. That sends a very strong message to the rest of the country. Don't have to worry about this anymore. For 2 weeks, we were all focused on Black Lives Matter, and most of the media channels were not talking about the concerns about no social distancing on the streets with tens of thousands of people chanting in comparatively confined spaces. Now, saying that doesn't mean you're opposed to Black Lives Matter. It means that science, it's a pandemic. And so the idea of leading with science means no matter who you support politically, first and foremost, you make sure you have a consistent message about the disease, about how to maintain safety. And we're not doing that in the United States, not even close.
Okay, so you've just brought a lot of this, but it all kind of coalesces around the message from the White House. And you have sources at the White House and at the top levels of government. What are they telling you about that maybe lack of leadership? And can you put the genie back in the bottle? I mean, the impact on everything, whether it's markets, whether it's consumers, it starts at the top. So can they get on top of this?
Well, I mean, you can't only blame the president. You do have to focus on governors. You do have to focus on Democrats and Republicans in office in Congress. You do have to focus on the media and how they've mishandled this, in my view. So from your question, I don't think you were asking this, but I just want to be clear. I think it would be incorrect to say everything that's going wrong is because we hate the president and he's an incompetent. But you asked me specifically about the White House, and I will say that in an election, and yes, it's really unfortunate this is happening in the teeth of a very divisive election because it makes it worse. They understand that the only thing that Trump is consistently beating Biden on right now, and he's beating him by a significant margin, by well over 10 points, is on the economy, handling the economy. And that if this election is about coronavirus, they think they're going to lose. They're probably right. So Trump and the White House is focused on we got to talk about opening up. We got to talk about confidence. We got to talk about getting people back to jobs, right? And to be fair, I mean, the economic response in the United States thus far, politically, from the Fed and from the House and Senate, both sides, Democrat and Republican, has been fairly robust and fairly early. As opposed to the healthcare response or the PPE response or the education of doing the right thing response, which has been a freaking disaster in the United States. So, yeah, I think the fact that Trump understands that his way to win, his pathway where he is down about 14 in the national polls right now, which is not a good place to be 4.5 months out, though Dukakis was even worse than that after the Democrat convention. I think he was down 17 at the max. So it's not like, it's not over by any means. But the focus on the economy means that you're not going to see Fauci out there the way he was, or Birx out there. You're not going to see the coronavirus task force. You're not going to see Trump paying as much attention to what people need to do, or supporting new lockdowns, not for a second wave, but the first wave that we are still very much in Southern California, in Florida, in Arizona, in Texas, very populous states where we're adding a hell of a lot of caseload. And one final point I want to make, people that are not saying don't worry about this are saying, well, not many people are dying. And first of all, death is a lagging indicator. I mean, there's a quote for you. We're not going to see people dying for several weeks until after they're hospitalized. Let's hope that the death load remains quite low. But we do not know what kind of long-term health indications young people that get this virus that aren't being hospitalized are going to have to live with. We don't know if they're going to be treated like smokers. If they're you're a smoker, you're taking 5 years off your life. We have most physicians out there are quite concerned, given what happens to your lungs when you get this coronavirus, well, what that could mean for you long term, and the cost of that on the American economy and on the human capital of the United States is immense, and no one's even thinking.
We hear it. No, Ian, we hear everything you're saying, right, Kristen?
Yeah. So, Ian, I was wondering, you're talking about essentially how much politically the president is taking a hit because of coronavirus. So then we're talking about stimulus that's coming to an end in July. Do you see the White House sort of pushing forward some sort of initiative or supporting, trying to shove more money at the American people to buoy that support all the way through November?
I absolutely do. And I see the Democrats doing that as well. I would be stunned if we don't get well over $1 trillion in additional stimulus by the end of the summer. Certainly, unemployment is going to be ghastly high through elections. And, right now you're going to have the unemployment benefits that were topped up are going to be running out. You're going to have a hell of a lot of companies, particularly small and medium enterprises, that are going to be facing bankruptcy. You're going to have all sorts of companies that can't pay their ongoing rent, their utilities bills. This has a knock-on impact on the broad global economy. We're nowhere close to out of the woods on this. So I can't imagine that the U.S. government is gonna let that hang. It's going to be very divisive over exactly what is inside that bill. I don't think we're going to do long-term infrastructure in a meaningful way, for example. But yeah, I think a lot more money is going to be thrown at the American economy.
Hey, Ian, can I take you to China for a moment? There's all kinds of trouble with the trade deal with China, Hong Kong, tensions relating over that. Do you think the trade deal will even still be intact by Election Day? And if it's not, will it matter?
I mean, Rick, not only can you not take me to China, you can't even take me to Europe or Canada right now because those countries are refusing to allow Americans in. That's what happens when you don't handle the coronavirus. Do I think the phase one deal is going to be intact? Navarro doesn't. He made that, the senior advisor on trade, the White House made that statement on CNBC. Markets futures go down a few hundred points, and within an hour, Trump tweets, "Oh, no. I mean, he got slapped both sides of his face, Navarro, right? That must have hurt. Deal's still in place. I mean, U.S.-China relations are certainly getting worse on almost every front, on South China Sea, on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, certainly, and you see a unanimous vote coming down in Senate today for tougher sanctions against Chinese officials because of the stripping away of autonomy of Hong Kong. You've got more sanctions coming down because of the Uyghurs. You've got technology issues. The Canadians getting caught up in that, and the Huawei arrest, and the moving towards extradition of the daughter of the founder. I mean, you cannot look at an issue between the U.S. and China right now that is moving in a good direction. There is not.
So is all of that an electoral issue, or is that kind of going over voters' heads?
Oh, no. It's. I mean, the election doesn't help. But I mean, when you have 100 members of Senate, 100 members supporting additional sanctions against the Chinese government for Hong Kong in a maximally polarized environment, that tells you this is not an election issue. You are very hard pressed to find anyone on the Hill right now that says we should be softer on China. Now, President Trump clearly understands that a hard line on China is particularly useful to distract from his own missteps around coronavirus. And blaming the Chinese and even using racist terminology for coronavirus itself is part of that strategy. He knows what he's doing. But if you could magic up Biden as president right now, the trajectory of the relationship would still get worse. The interesting thing is, despite all of that, Trump is holding on to this phase one trade deal, and it's because he knows what it's going to do to the markets if it blows up. And that's despite the fact that the Chinese are not going to come remotely close to executing on the deal that they signed. I mean, they're not going to buy the American ag that they promised this year, and Trump is still giving them a pass. Now, the advisors I've spoke to in the White House, including some very senior ones, are telling me that on balance, they think the deal will not last through the election, but it's very close. And ultimately, that decision is going to be made by one guy, and it ain't those advisors.
Ian, I also want to ask you about one more issue and how it's going to play into the campaign as we head toward the fall, and that's the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement and the push for racial equality in the United States, where President Trump has not polled well. He's not done a good job by many measures. Do you think that the protests are going to have enough staying power that that is going to continue to be an issue for him as we get closer to the election?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think Trump is in any danger of winning the black vote. I think we can be clear on that. The fact that the House and Senate have been unable to come up with any compromise on police reform. I mean, it kind of reminds you of Newtown and gun control. And there, Obama was very strong, and Biden, then vice president, was very strong, and they got nothing done at the national level. So I think Black Lives Matter has lots of legs. It does make an impact, but largely in changing policing practices, funding, training, litigation against police, more transparency at the state and at the local level. That's where you get movement. That's meaningful movement in the United States. It's a good thing that we have a federal system. That's what's happened on gun control too. But is that enough to keep them going through November? Especially when the economy is coming back, when the weather is not as nice, when people are at work, maybe when some schools are open. I mean, part of the reason this exploded is because there's massive structural racism in the US and because these videos were so viscerally horrible to watch. But part of it is because a whole bunch of people, especially Black Americans, but also all of us, have been cooped up, many of which unemployed at home for a few months. And suddenly, you've got something to go and mobilize for. Screw it. I'm on the streets and I was scared even to talk to people, but this matters more. I can now get out there. And I mean, it is, again, I can't say enough. We're now watching in Los Angeles County explosion of cases where just yesterday, the head of public health for LA said that significant pieces of that are linked to these tens of thousands of people tightly packed that were protesting in favor of Black Lives Matter.
Right, although we haven't seen that explosion in other areas, right? And there have been some various explanations in that. We have to leave it there, Ian, but it's always really great to get some time with you, and we will hope to see you again soon. Ian Bremmer is the Eurasia Group founder and president. Take care, Ian.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.